Hello everyone, this is your instructor Mr. Lucier, and I'm going to be making a review for the final exam. So we have up here on the screen just a couple of things that a couple of announcements that I want to make before we kind of get into the actual chapters that will be on the final exam. So first of all, one thing to note, go ahead and get rid of this. One thing to note is that week 7 is our last week. It is kind of an unusual thing to have a 7-week course as opposed to a 5-week or an 8-week course, but that's in fact what our time schedule is. So we're jumping into the last week here. And out of all the weeks this semester, this is the one where your workload will likely be the greatest. So I just want everybody to at least be aware of what they have ahead of you. You'll be completing the, as you can see up here, you have this week the chapter quizzes to cover. And of course, you need to cover those chapters before the final exam. 13 through 15 will be on the exam. There is a primary source discussion. This is the last discussion to participate in. Again, read the source, follow the directions, reply to your peers. The last essay assignment, which I imagine will be the most time-consuming of all of the assignments. That's also due at the end of week 7. And lastly, the final exam. And unlike the midterm, because there was an odd number of weeks, for the midterm, you got to turn in your essay and exam on 2 different weeks. For the final here, they're both due on the same week, so just be aware of that. So, it's really important, I would say, in this very last week to manage your time appropriately. Sunday, August 9th is the last day of the semester. And once that, Sunday, August 9th reaches midnight, our semester is over and I will no longer be accepting anything or any work past that date. So just, give yourself kind of a good situation to where you can succeed. But anyways, let's not talk about those other assignments. Let's go ahead and talk about the final exam. So the final exam is in the same format as your midterm exam. So I think one of the most important things to note for the exam, of course, is this time limit. It's 25 questions. 45 minutes. And that sounds like a lot, but the questions do have multiple parts to them. So just make sure that you are preparing and studying before going into the final exam. You will not have enough time to look up the answers, and that is by design, right? So if you think you'll have enough time to find the answers as you're taking the exam, that will not be the case. You're going to want to know this content before going in. So be prepared. Like the other midterm exam, you get 3 attempts on the final exam. Partial credit is awarded for partially correct answers, so do your best to get as many correct as you can. And of course, like the midterm exam, no late exam. So it's going to open up on Monday. The final exam will open up on Monday. You can start taking it that day, and then of course it comes to a conclusion or closes on Sunday. You'll be getting the same types of questions. Matching, where I'm going to ask you to, I'll have a list of maybe 4 or 5 people, 4 or 5 events. You have to match it with the proper definition. Multiple answer is going to ask you about a particular, event or moment, historically speaking, large enough to where I can ask you multiple parts to it. Drop down fill in the blank will require you to read a paragraph and choose the correct people, places, events that properly and accurately fit in with it. And lastly, chronological order will give you a series of events, ask you to place 1 through 5, how they occurred in which order, right? 1 being earliest and 5 being the latest. It's not necessarily about remembering the date to everything, but really kind of, do you understand how these events played out, right? Causes and consequences. The key thing in terms of what you are expected to know, just like the midterm exam, study those chapter outlines. The chapter quizzes are kind of a good way to just kind of check for understanding as you read through the content. They reward you and give you points for having completed them. but they're relatively low risk. You can do them as many times as you want, the chapter quizzes, that is. And they don't cover every single thing, right? The chapter outlines are really what you're required to know. So that's actually what we're going to go ahead and cover right now. So the final exam is one more important thing to note. The final exam is not cumulative. I will say that again. It is not a cumulative exam. You're only going to be tested from chapter 9 to chapter 15. So the first half, what you were tested on the midterm, that's done and over with, begins with chapter 9 and moves through chapter 15. So why don't we go ahead and get started breaking down some of these chapters here. So again, the purpose here will not be to fill in every single part of this outline. Like the midterm exam, these outlines are based on the book. So your red section titles are kind of the large sections within each chapter. Your blue section titles are those subsections. As a general rule, if a red section or blue section appears on the chapter outline, that's typically a portion of the book that I want you to read. If you don't see the section title on the outline, you are more than welcome to go ahead and skip that section. In other words, what that means is that I'm not going to ask you any questions about that part of the book. And so there are some chapters where you can skip parts of the book, and then there are other chapters where you got to kind of read through and understand everything. So that's kind of how these outlines are created. So these are section titles, subsection titles, and then within each subsection, I'm specifically pointing out kind of the key terms or the key people, key points that you should study and prepare for and understand for the final exam. So this is going to be much more of kind of a bird's eye view of these chapters. And of course, it will probably be very helpful if you have your outlines with you. Now, as you've been going through the book, as you've been filling out the chapter quizzes, I hope that you've been filling these things out. That's going to help you and pay off when it comes to the final exam. If not, go ahead and bring it out now, and this will be kind of a good way to create sort of a study guide for the final. So let's go ahead and begin with chapter 9. So just kind of starting where we left off with chapter 8. Chapter 8 was what we call the era of good feelings. And of course, a key hallmark of the era of good feelings was this idea of political unity. That the Federalist Party, the old Federalist Party that we learned about during the midterm exam, the Federalist Party was no longer in action. And as a result, it was only the Republican Party that continued to exist after that point. However, this was complicated somewhat. In fact, I had also mentioned in chapter 8 that although this was the era of good feelings, there were some rifts or divisions within the rifts and divisions within the United States at the time. But this was further complicated by the rise of Andrew Jackson. And the very last thing that we learned about in chapter, hold on one second. The very last thing that we learned about in chapter 8 was when Andrew Jackson ran for the presidency, was ultimately defeated by John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay with the corrupt bargain, and then re-ran again in 1828, winning the presidency. And Andrew Jackson, for a lot of reasons, really represented the interests of the common man, we might say. And this was a major political change because at that point, really the only people who had been elected to the presidency were those that were associated not only with the American Revolution directly, but were sort of part of what they called the Virginia dynasty. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. These were the elites in society. And Andrew Jackson had broken a lot of those norms. He was a general, he was a fighter, he was born in the West, he was from Tennessee, he had dueled and killed people. he could barely read. His literacy, there's some questions about to what degree was he literate. So he wasn't sort of your typical elite Virginian politician. And because you had an expanding democratic process, remember, the key thing here that allows Andrew Jackson to get elected is that in terms of voting, right? For voting in the United States, there were more or less 3 requirements. You had to be male. You had to be white persons is what they called it. And you had to pay some sort of tax or own property. So these were the criteria. And what was changing in the 1820s, and this is why this is called the age of democracy or Jacksonian democracy or whatever it is, the thing that's changing is that states are beginning to eliminate this requirement. And so many states change their voting laws to say, well, you don't have to own property. You don't have to pay taxes. In fact, any white male can vote. And what that allows for is a lot of people voting who had never voted before. And, they represent sort of this constituency of what we might call commoners. And they end up voting for Andrew Jackson. The consequence of this is that you see a new political system emerge, a new party system. Now, recall the first party system was between the Federalists and the Republicans. The second party system, which is what this is called, eventually rises with the election of Andrew Jackson. Jackson represents the Democrats. Jackson's opponents represent the Whigs. So the Whigs and the Democrats make up the 2-party system. And as a result of that, you have the growth of this new political system. Jackson, upon coming to office, he implements what's known as the spoils system. That is to reward people who were loyal to him, right? Reward people who were loyal to him. Okay, let's go on to the next section. All right, 1 second here. Okay, sorry about that. We should be good now, I think. Okay. All right. So, Chapter 9 begins with the presidency of Andrew Jackson and sort of this new kind of revolution, democratically speaking, and that's kind of, where this leaves off. Now, during Jackson's presidency, there's a couple of very important topics to know, and these, in some ways, sort of foreshadow what's coming up on the horizon for the United States. So I'll sort of point these out. The first one is what's called the Nullification Crisis. Now, to nullify something means to essentially cancel out a federal law. And I'd mentioned this before, right, that one of kind of the key tenets to understand about how our American system works is to understand the relationship of federalism. And federalism states that you have 2 entities. You have the federal government, in other words, we can call this the U.S., and then you have states. And this is put forward in the Constitution. And it says that there are some things that the federal government can do, right? So, for example, raise an army, declare war on other countries. Those are only things that the federal government can do. There are some things that states can do. States have their own voting laws, for example. They have their own laws in regards to education. There are certain laws that the states pass. But then there is also sort of this shared relationship. And one of the key conflicts that you find in this particular period is the conflict between states and the federal government. Of course, this is actually, in pretty much all of American history, you have conflicts between the states and the national government. And so what nullification states is that when the federal government, right, i.e. Congress, passes a law, whatever that law may be. In this case, it was a tariff, which was a tax on an imported good. John C. Calhoun, vice president and later senator from South Carolina, and the state of South Carolina essentially said that we are going to nullify this law. So Congress passes the tariff. South Carolina says, no, right? We're not going to follow that. The tariff hurts us. We're an agrarian nation. We don't have the same type of industry that the North has, so we're not going to follow it. We're going to invoke the 10th Amendment, which states rights, or which puts forward this idea of states' rights, and we're not going to do it. And so this creates the crisis, right? The nullification crisis. And the big question is, well, who exactly is right here? Is it ultimately states' rights, or is it national power? And this is really what the Webster-Hayne debate is about. Robert Hayne represents the state's position. Daniel Webster represents the federal position. And of course, there's a huge debate to be had here, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, which one holds kind of the supreme position? And the two, of course, go back and forth, and you have a chance to actually read that debate with one of the primary sources. The crisis eventually leads to Congress passing the Force Bill, and this allows Andrew Jackson to use force against South Carolina if necessary. That means if the tariff needs to be enforced through the military, right, by military force, Congress essentially allows Andrew Jackson to do that. It's a point in which you almost have an actual armed conflict break out between South Carolina and the national government. It doesn't happen. Henry Clay, the great compromiser of the time, eventually does come to the rescue, creates a compromised tariff that eventually expires over time. But this crisis, or this question about nullification, does a couple of things. First, it really highlights this debate here, right? States' rights versus national power. Who ultimately has the final decision-making process, and where do they stand? Jackson ultimately sided with the federal government here, right, saying that South Carolina, essentially over his dead body, would reject or nullify the tariff. But it really highlights or really foreshadows rather, the divide between the states and the national government in the years leading up to the Civil War. Because once again, this time in the 1860s, so all this crisis right here is happening during the 1830s. So this is 30 years before the Civil War. But in the 1850s and 1860s, when the issue is slavery, see here the issue is tariffs, right? The issue is taxes essentially here. When the issue becomes slavery in the 1850s and 1860s, once again, you will have a lot of these southern states invoking this idea of states' rights and states' rights theory. So it's a very important development and very important event to have happened during Jackson's presidency. So that's one. The second important thing, moving on to the next section, is the change in policy of the U.S. government and Native Americans that occur during President Andrew Jackson. We've talked about this a little bit earlier, and not to go into too much detail because you're not going to be essentially tested on it, but we had talked about what U.S. policy was towards Native Americans, towards these tribal units. We had started off with this idea of nations within a nation, that Native Americans are completely separate from the U.S. government. They are not American citizens, but at the same time, they have control and the rights over their own territory. They are sovereign. The Cherokee are like the French, right? Completely different country, different set of rules, different set of laws. This was practiced for, it remains the predominant approach that the U.S. government has, but we also have to understand some of the complications made with the federal system. So the Cherokee were not always dealing with the federal government, but the Cherokee often had to deal with state governments. And state governments, for the most part, could, just like in the case of tariffs, not always agree with the federal policy. Now, when Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase, you had kind of a different route open up, and this was the policy of assimilation. That is for Native Americans to assimilate to become American, to speak English, to become Christians, to become individual landowners like Americans do, and just sort of meld into American society. And for some that could work, but for others that was not an option. At the same time, those who rejected assimilation, there was, you could say sort of a growing impatience among the American government, state governments, local governments for those Native Americans who rejected assimilation. So it wasn't, I would say it wasn't any better or worse of a solution, right? It just sort of depended on various circumstances. The big change that occurs here during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, of course, this is important to note, is that these policies of assimilation and sovereignty essentially give way to the policy of removal, right? Indian removal. And this begins more or less with the Indian Removal Act. Now recall, acts, laws, who are these passed by? They're passed by Congress, right? Congress is the Senate and the House of Representatives. Who makes up the members of Congress? Well, this, of course, are the states. So in this sort of change in policy, ultimately, who is voting to remove Native Americans from lands within the states? It's the state governments themselves. And here, again, is where understanding the division of power is crucial because it helps make sense of what exactly is going on. Remember, we have our three branches of government, our executive, which is the president, our legislative, which is Congress, and our judicial. And we have our series of checks and balances that no one branch can overpower the other, right? This is completely within the federal government. And then at the same time, you have your states. And we just talked about federalism and the way that sort of this this sort of back and forth sort of, goes back and forth with one another. So in terms of taking the initiative of removing Indians from lands, which they had already made treaties with the government on, it is this branch right here, right? It's the legislative branch. So the question then becomes, well, and it begins with the state of Georgia, even though Georgia is not the only state that is responsible for this, but this is mostly kind of where it comes from. Georgia wants to remove the five quote-unquote civilized tribes, and that consists of groups like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and I'm forgetting one of the other tribes that you have there, but we're more or less use the Cherokee as an example. So Georgia, you have the state of Georgia. Actually, what does Georgia look like? Georgia looks something like this, right? The state of Georgia. And then you have lands here, right? And this is where the Cherokee live. And of course, this is in line with this idea of nations within the nation. It's a nation of Cherokee living within the borders of the United States. Well, that relationship or that treaty is between the federal government and the Cherokee, right? You got to go back to Washington, D.C. There's an agreement between these two groups that the Cherokee can keep their land. However, the state of Georgia wants to remove the Cherokee. And that is this court case right here, Worcester versus Georgia. And the question is, does the state of Georgia have the right to remove the Cherokee Indians? John Marshall, who is in charge of the Supreme Court, right? He's in charge of the legislative branch, ultimately rules in favor of the Cherokee. So you have on the one hand, Congress saying remove. You have the judicial branch, John Marshall, saying the Cherokee can stay where they are because that's a federal treaty. And the federal, if you know anything about John Marshall, like I said, the federal government always reigns supreme, right? So the Cherokee can stay. The ultimate question then is decided by the executive, right? And who is the executive? It is Andrew Jackson. And Jackson infamously says, more or less, John Marshall has made his decision. Let him enforce it, or let him try to enforce it. In other words, the executive branch and Andrew Jackson say remove. Even though the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee could stay, the branches and those parts of the U.S. government that are responsible for enforcing the law, right? The executive branch with federal troops states have their own state troops and, law enforcement that can do this. They ultimately say that the Cherokee and others will be removed. And so this gives rise then to the Trail of Tears, which essentially gives the 5 tribes, says, look, you have, 2 years to remove yourself from the land. And if you don't, you'll be forcibly removed. And so for those that stayed and occupied the land in defiance of the states and in defiance of the president, with the support of the judicial branch, were forcibly removed. And that removal involved the deaths of 4,000 Native Americans who were relocated to Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma. In other places, like the Seminoles in Florida, they were more effective in resisting this forcible removal. But kind of the key point to understand here is this change, right? This is a significant change in, in U.S. policy towards indigenous populations, and arguably, I would say probably, with not, maybe not even arguably, the lowest point in terms of the relationship between the United States and Native Americans. So that's also the second thing to note about Andrew Jackson's presidency. Third thing, Jackson's Bank War. Not too much to discuss here, except for the fact that, recall, Jackson really represented this struggle of common versus elite class. And despite everybody telling that destroying the national bank was a bad idea, Andrew Jackson does away with it anyways. Jackson uses the veto more so than any other president before him, so much so that Jackson is labeled, and I think it's right here, is labeled by his opponents as King Andrew. Now, of course, Jackson supporters are your Democrats. Jackson opponents are your Whigs. And that second party system, Democrats and Whigs, they eventually do find their own kind of voices and positions. But this party system of either being a Democrat or a Whig very much begins as, are you for Jackson or are you against Jackson? So after Jackson's presidency, again, significant for those 3 reasons. We had just discussed them. Significant for the Nullification Crisis, Indian removal policy, and lastly, Jackson's Bank War, which he gets rid of the national bank despite... And destroying the national bank was really just kind of a symbol for the common class who viewed the national bank as being corrupt, right? It was politics, it was bankers, it was Wall Street, get rid of the bank, and that's sort of a huge victory for the quote-unquote common man. One thing, a couple of other important things that get mentioned here. The American system, great key term to know, right? You actually had a primary source about the American system. The Great Triumvirate refers to the 3 senators who really dominated U.S. politics in the pre-Civil War period. We're talking about John Calhoun, who represents the South. We've got Daniel Webster, who represents the North, right? So in Congress, all of these debates are happening between these positions. And then we have our good friend Henry Clay, who always represents compromise, right? And this is especially a time, especially after Jackson, when Jackson leaves, Martin Van Buren becomes the next president, and then we've got some other individuals as well. But, really in this period between the 1830s, really all the way up until Lincoln in 1860, to be honest. I mean, there is one very important president in the middle, Polk, who we'll talk about. But pretty much in this period, you have very weak presidents, weak leadership. And it's really Congress that kind of pushes the debate and pushes forward policy. So John Calhoun represents the southern position, Webster the northern position, Henry Clay represents the position of compromise. Just a couple of other things at the very end here. The log cabin campaign. One of the changes that removing property requirements did was to give rise to what we call mass politics. in a country where essentially a lot more people can vote, you have to go out and get people's votes. So, political parties, campaigns, platforms, everything that is involved with trying to get people to vote for your side is sort of involved here. The Whigs win the presidency in 1840 with William Henry Harrison. He was a war hero of 1812, and he dies in office. John Tyler, another president, assumes power right after him. So that concludes Chapter 9, the chapter on the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Let's go to Chapter 10. So the next two chapters, Chapter 10 and 11, are important because they talk about the United States from about 1850 to 18, in fact, one of your writing assignments is sort of based on these two chapters. And what they're looking at are the ways that the country changed in these years, more or less in the years leading up to the Civil War. Chapter 10 is all about how the North changed. Chapter 11 is all about how the South changed, right? And one thing that becomes clear after reading these chapters is that, in 1815, the North and South, they could work together on a lot of issues, and they did. And you had a lot of evidence to suggest that Northern and Southern states, even though they had their differences, and of course the big difference between the two is slavery. Northern states have gotten rid of it, Southern states have not. But even so, even between free and slave, they could still work together on a lot of things. But by the time you get to 1850, these two parts of the country have changed so much that they can't agree with each other, right? There's less compromise. So, just kind of take note of that. Chapter 10, how the North changes. Chapter 11, how the South changes. So looking at some of the differences, right? So what changes in the North? A big one is population, specifically population in relation to immigration. This has some consequences in giving rise to new political parties, but the North in particular, right? What is one way that the North and South differ or diverge? The Northern population grows considerably, and it grows considerably due to immigration. What's another way that the North changes in these years? Huge changes in transportation. The biggest development here being, of course, the steam engine. The steam engine allows for things like steamships. Most importantly, trains. You have the building of canals, which are man-made rivers. Let's see, where do we got trains right here? Total railroad trackage. You even have the development of Morse code, right? Technology plays a big role here. And generally speaking, in the North, people are kind of brought together by this infrastructure. Again, this is something that's unique to the North. You look at where were most of the canals built, where were most of the trains built, where were most of the telegraphs built? Well, it's mostly in the North, and it has a profound impact on changing society. One way that it changes society, or actually I'll get to that in a moment. So changes in the North, one, we got population. Two, we got transportation, right? Trains, steamships, canals. The third one is going to be production. And this is mostly because of the factory system. A factory is, it's a structure that allows for the mass production of goods. Pretty much the shift here is you're going from handmade to machine-made. And there's so many consequences to this. Consequences not just in the economics. I mean, the economics is one, but also going to be changes in the way that society functions. So, for example, when everything was handmade, people more or less lived in kind of what we might call villages. But now with the rise of factories, it forces everybody to move to the cities. So you have the massive growth of cities as opposed to what's going on in the South. In the South, you don't really have a lot of urban areas. So for example, on the eve of the Civil War, out of the top 10 largest cities in the United States, only one was in the South, and that was New Orleans. All the other largest cities were in the North, and that has a lot to do with the fact that you have these factory systems that originated in the Northeast, but are mostly built in the North, right? And you can begin to see how you can contrast the North and South in this way. There are some interesting kind of things when we regard factory work. The Lowell system is one of these early experiments in how factory owners tried to create this new industrial urban society. There's a little bit of talk about how tough the conditions were. They certainly were tough. How many immigrants occupied these cities. How artisans, good key term to know. An artisan is somebody who makes stuff with their hands. Right? What effect did the factory system have on people who used to make things with their hands? Short answer is it put them out of business. Unions allowed for workers to come together and fight for better conditions. And you had some Supreme Court cases and legal disputes when it actually came to worker rights. In terms of patterns of society, this is the way that the Industrial Revolution, so the Industrial Revolution is the term used to describe the effects that steam power had on society. So trains and factories. What did that do to the landscape? You had the chance to read a primary source from Lyman Beecher. He's one of these he's a preacher in the cities at this time. He talked about some of the problems involving alcoholism, et cetera, et cetera. But also in these societies, it's important to note that in northern cities, while slavery was banned, illegal in the North, that you did have a considerable constituents of free blacks who lived in the North, who lived in these urban areas alongside whites, alongside immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. The way that, or the sort of the effect of the Industrial Revolution on society, you can kind of outline that here. The rise of certain cultural norms like separate spheres, that's, and the cult of domesticity, that's kind of like, the rise of this notion that there's men's work and there's women's work. This was very prevalent in the North, and that despite the fact that slavery was prohibited, you still did have racial prejudice, and this was reinforced through leisurely activities like minstrel shows, for example. So all of these things get a little bit more at the culture and society in the North, right? And of course, when assessing and comparing how the North and South compare to one another, you could look at culture and society. The last major change that kind of takes place in the North is the change to farming. For the most part, this is referred to, I don't think it's actually mentioned. If it's mentioned, I must have missed it. But it's mentioned as the market revolution. And the trains allow farmers to sell their goods. And so even for those who lived in the rural parts of the country, which was still most of the population, they went from growing their food to consume it to growing it to sell. Right? And this market revolution, which allows farmers to go from consuming their own food, so you grow it, you eat it, to growing it and then selling it, has a pretty profound impact on the way that people live in the North. So that's chapter 10, right? Chapter on the North. Chapter 11. So chapter 11 is all about the changes in the South between 1815 and 1850. Right, 1850. And of course, there's kind of a, something key here, of course, is going to be slavery and the role that slavery plays in this development. Now, with the North, it's a little bit more complicated of a story, right? There are a lot of different changes going on. There's changes in population, there's immigration, transportation, production, the rise of cities, the rise of farming or market farming. In the South, there's really just one underlying change, and then everything is affected by that. And really the key thing to know here is that the change is that in the South, they go from growing these things, historically tobacco, rice, sugar, right? We talked about, for example, the Chesapeake plantations and how tobacco was grown there. Tobacco was a major cash crop. You go from growing these things to growing cotton, and everything else follows, right? So the big change in the South is that the plantations go from tobacco, rice, and sugar to growing cotton. And there were a lot of things that made this possible, specifically industry, right? Think of it this way. Before, when everything was handmade, right, before the Industrial Revolution, before the steam engine, you could only make clothing as fast as your hands could do it. But now with the steam engine, which runs a machine and then the machine makes it for you, you can pretty much make clothing and textiles 24/7. So the more cotton, the better, right? So much so that it was said in the South that cotton was king. And this leads to, huge transformations in the South. One is that slavery becomes much more widespread, right? It grows in terms of the number of slaves that are required. Slavery, which had been kind of declining at the time, with the rise of cotton shoots up dramatically, and not only increases in terms of number, but also spread to the Deep South. So, for example, you look at the United States in 1800. Most slaves are in Virginia. By the time you get to the Civil War, slavery has spread across Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, etc., etc. The second Middle Passage refers to the interstate slave trade. That is trading slaves between states. Now recall, the Constitution had made importing slaves from overseas illegal, right? The transatlantic slave trade, the first Middle Passage, that was illegal, although, of course, smuggling did occur. But what was really big was trading slaves between states. And because there was not a lot of transportation in the South, you couldn't just hop on a train. It was usually pretty difficult, right? The second Middle Passage. So the second Middle Passage is the trip that slaves took when they were sold from the upper South, that's Virginia, to the lower South, which would be something like Texas. In comparison to Northern society, Southern society is more or less straightforward. You have your planters, those who own the plantation. You have what we call the plain folk, which are your free white citizens. And then you have slaves. And for the most part, if you're a member of Southern society, you fit into one of those three categories. Now, when it came to slave ownership, this is an important point to know because it makes, it makes one of the questions regarding the Civil War all the more interesting, is that when it came to slave ownership, it was only, in fact, a small percentage of white Southerners who owned slaves. You had something like the planter class, which made up perhaps only 3% to 1% of the population. To belong to the planter class, you had to own more than 20 slaves. But they held all the positions in government. They had all the positions when it came to things like land ownership. And then you had a smaller subsection of what we would call plain folk, where perhaps anywhere between, we'll say 20% or so owned at least one slave. And so for the vast majority of the other plain folk, the 80% or so, that in fact most were not rich enough or wealthy enough to own any slaves, which kind of gives rise to this question then, why were so many willing to fight for the Confederacy in the Civil War, which of course is an interesting question to look at. When we look at the culture and society of the South, whereas in the North things like materialism were very important, instead, there was a much stronger emphasis on things like honor and chivalry. So cultural values tended to be different. In terms of other cultural aspects, the South was, generally speaking, less educated than Northerners. Standard of living was lower. And despite this, there was still a strong emphasis on race. So, for example, many of the plain folk and the slaves, they might have a lot in common. They have a lot in common in terms of the houses they live in, the food that they eat, their standard of living, their life expectancy, much more in common with one another than the planter class. However, because there was a difference in race, white and black, the plain folk never really saw slaves as kind of their, not only their equals, but their sort of common class. It's for this reason, it's for the reason of race, that the plain folk associate themselves with the planters and not the slaves. So that was still very important in the South, very important. In terms of slavery, cotton has a huge impact on slaves. Just a couple of things to note here. Although slavery in the Western world was on the decline everywhere else, it was on the sharp rise in the United States. That slavery was enforced by the law, and law equals violence, of course. Generally speaking, with the shift to cotton, life as a slave got more difficult, right? Maybe with the exception of sugar. Sugar was a pretty difficult crop to grow as well, but generally speaking, cotton meant a harder life for slaves. Although there were some who earned their freedom, either through manumission, through escaping, through running away, through purchasing their loved ones or themselves, there was a constituency of free blacks in the South. In fact, most free blacks who lived in the United States in the antebellum period, and antebellum refers to before the Civil War, were in the South. But the vast majority, anywhere between 4 to 5 million, were slaves. The free black population was maybe around 500,000, to give you kind of a comparison. Like we mentioned before, the slave trade resistance. So one of the things that we had mentioned before was that when it came to resistance, the most effective form of resistance for slaves was running away. And that remained true. We talked about earlier for some of the reasons why revolts and rebellions were not as common in the United States as they were in North America, as they were in other parts of the country. They weren't as common in North America as they were in places like the Caribbean or South America. But there are some important revolts to take note of, especially Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, which is the most violent slave revolt in American history. The story of the Underground Railroad and the effort to allow slaves to escape, and the day-to-day resistance which took place in all across the South and what that meant. So this section focusing much more so on the actual lives and effect that cotton had. Remember, there was a way that slaves lived, and some of these things stayed the same and some of these things changed. But cotton had a profound impact, right? Especially this idea of the second middle passage. Looks like my neighbor's fire alarm or something like that is going off, so excuse the beeping, but I guess that is the there we go. That's what you get for working at home, I suppose. But really what cotton did, because what cotton did was it tore families apart. Whereas you had, slaves were primarily located in the Chesapeake on tobacco plantations, lived there for generation to generation. Once cotton hits, suddenly families are broken up and sent all across the country. And this puts a lot of uncertainty on things like culture, which was entirely passed down through oral tradition, because it was illegal in most places for slaves to read and write, or even to teach slaves how to read and write. And families were broken apart, right? And so in some ways, I would say probably in most ways, cotton was overall had a negative impact, right, on slavery. Absolutely, although you could point to something like standard of living maybe increasing a lot. But it was really the uncertainty around selling, the second middle passage, culture, family, more difficult work. The violence and the laws, that more or less had had remained the same during that time. So in thinking about that. And of course, the last section here talks a little bit about more about what culture was like, right? So touch upon some of those things. So chapter 10, chapter 11, right? Think about the way that the country changed in those years, how the North became an industrial, urban place where many immigrants moved to, type of area. And the South grew in terms of cotton plantations, grew in terms of the number of slaves, grew in terms of where slaves were located in the country, and really became dependent on this king cotton, right? Cotton is king. So those two chapters are going to be very important for, if you're writing the essay topic on how the North and South changed between 1815 and 1850. It's a good two chapters to focus on. Okay, chapter 12. So chapter 12 of all the chapters, I would say probably the chapter that, I hate to say it, but probably the least important chapter for the final exam. Some interesting things here. I would say there's certainly, there are people to know and terms to know, but in terms of kind of like the overall narrative of what's going on in the country leading up to the Civil War, probably not as significant. So there's a lot about kind of like American literature and artwork in here. You can just kind of skip over that. But new ideas. So Northern society went through a big transformation. And so this transformation kind of created for many people a crisis, right? Think about it. Your way of life has just changed significantly, right? Everything that you knew about the world is different, right? You used to have to get by, you got around riding on a horse. Now you go on a train. You made things with your hand. Now they're made in factories. And so people, to kind of put it, in sort of simple terms, kind of freaked out, right? They freaked out about everything that had changed. And so this crisis led to, in some ways, problems, whatever those problems were. And those problems then led to new ideas. And these are kind of the new ideas, right? So that's kind of what chapter 12 focuses on. And a lot of these new ideas are reform movements. So let's just talk about some of them. Transcendentalists, they really like to emphasize the individual. They had said that all this change that had taken place had caused people to lose their individual identity. Utopians, they really looked at radical solutions, right? They were kind of like anti-capitalist in a way. The Oneidas and the Shakers, these were other utopian communities that sought to change gender roles, the role that men and women have in society. And there were groups that started new religions. For example, Mormonism was founded in this period by Joseph Smith. And Mormonism offered an alternative to the predominant religious kind of movement at the time, and that was the Second Great Awakening. And the way that you can interpret all these new ideas here, right, whether it's about gender, the economy, transcendentalists are kind of about philosophy, whether it's new religious ideas, all of this is coming because of the transformations taking place in American society, right? Things that are dramatically changing. However, some people said that, let's kind of leave gender roles alone. Let's leave capitalism alone. Let's leave democracy alone. Let's not have kind of these more radical solutions, but let's just try and make society better. That transformations led to problems, and problems need reform. So the temperance movement dealt with the rise of alcoholism, the rise of public education, that is tax-funded schools, also rose as a result of nationalizing these newly immigrant populations, also wanted to take kids off the streets. Child labor, child homelessness was a big problem. The prison system was a big problem, right? Criminal justice, there was a general rise in crime. And what all of these movements had in common, reform movements, was that women were a big part of it. Because we're in a time period here where women are excluded from the right to vote, excluded from holding public office, really encouraged through ideas like the cult of domesticity and like separate spheres, encouraged to shy away from public life. And these reform movements allowed women like Dorothea Dix to go out and have a voice publicly. And what many of these women found or encountered in this public arena was that they were receiving pushback from simply being women, right? The fact that they were women. And many of them, like Sarah and Angelina Grimke, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, like Susan B. Anthony, who, by the way, were all reformers, took up the cause of women's rights and feminism. And this ultimately led to the first feminist movement. Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. There's a manifesto written up that strictly puts the goal of the feminist movement as suffrage, or the right to vote. And really what Seneca Falls is that, it kicks off a 70-year-long movement in order to achieve women's suffrage or the right to vote in the United States. So while these movements here had the immediate consequence of trying to solve problems in society, crime, alcoholism, etc., one of the consequences of this was that it gave rise to the first women's movement, the first feminist movement. Now, in terms of our class, the most important reform movement to give rise during this period is the Abolitionist Movement. Right? And the reason why it's important for our class is because this is ultimately what culminates in the Civil War. So just like American society had changed in terms of the rise of alcohol consumption, the rise of crime, urban areas, etc., slavery had also increased dramatically, and it was increasing at a rate at which, many in the United States became alarmed that slavery would just continue to grow forever, and that if left unchecked, there'd be no stop to it. And so this is kind of where the abolitionists come in. You have the very first anti-slavery society in the American Colonization Society, which creates Liberia, located in Africa, a colony for freed American slaves. But there are going to be some very important people to know in this section. I guarantee there will be a question asking you to match the accomplishments of abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? This is a section in chapter 12 which is just asking for me to make a matching question, asking you to match what their contributions were. One way that you might be able to, and of course you're going to want to know John Brown and Lovejoy and know these people as well. But one thing that differentiates Truth and Douglass from Stowe, Brown, Garrison, and the rest, but they were actual slaves themselves. They'd grown up as slaves, escaped it. Douglass escaped it. Truth was emancipated when New York outlawed slavery. But they could speak on personal experience. And so it's the abolitionists then that begin to really push push the country towards dealing with this problem that otherwise politicians don't really want to deal with. So know your abolitionists. Okay, chapter 13. Chapter 13, I will say, probably the most important chapter for your final exam. Chapter 13 looks at the causes of the Civil War. How do you get from just two different parts of the country, all right? The North and South become very different, but just because they were different doesn't mean they have to fight each other, right? So what leads to the actual fighting? And again, this is where you're really going to want to be able to kind of parse out some of the differences and parse out some of the nuance when it comes to the chronological order. Again, the events, how these events unfold in the proper order in which they unfold is something just to kind of, keep details on, right? Keep details on. So here's the thing about the Civil War. The key root of the Civil War is, of course, or what's at the root, I should say, is the issue of slavery. But when you look at how the Civil War unfolds, it's not slavery per se. It is slavery in Western land, right? Slavery in Western land. And for the most part, America had gotten to a point, or was at a point, I should say, between the North states, which were free, and the Southern states, which were slave, where there was no disagreement really on the status of slavery in the country as it exists, right? When the 13 colonies became the 13 states, and when they drafted the Constitution, they had members of northern states who had chose to free slavery, and they had southern states which had chose to kept it. And for the most part, northerners and southerners kind of recognized that, okay, if the South wants to have slavery, that's fine. Let it be, right? Nobody is really talking about, the abolitionists are, of course, but nobody in politics is really talking about abolishing slavery in South Carolina, right? South Carolina was there at the Revolution. They were there at the Constitution. They want to have slavery legal in their state. Northern states, more or less, they're not going to touch slavery in South Carolina. And the vice versa is true. The fact that Pennsylvania is a free state, that doesn't really bother the southern states. The problem is, and the problem arises when new states enter into the Union. And when it's a new state that comes into the Union, that's where the disagreement really begins to heat up. And of course, we already talked about one of these things because it highlights the fundamental problem here. And that was the case of Missouri, right? When Missouri was ready to become a state in 1820, how the North and South fought over that. Now, eventually they got a compromise, right? Eventually there was a compromise, the Missouri Compromise, which you needed to know for your midterm. But the problem of Missouri and the debate over whether Missouri should be free or slave is going to play out over and over and over again until the country goes to war. Now, looking at chapter 13, this first crisis over slavery in Western territory arises over Texas, right? Now, the story of Texas, it's a little bit different than what occurs with Missouri. Texas had previously been part of Mexico, but people like Stephen Austin, like Sam Houston, and what we call Texans eventually do declare independence. So in 1836, Texas becomes an independent republic. That's the reason why they call it the Lone Star State. It was its own country. And unlike Mexico, who had abolished slavery, Texas moves to legalize it. Right? And so the question is, well, should Texas become part of the U.S.? And this is when some of the debates arise, right? Because if you're a state and you legalize slavery, and now you want to become part of the U.S., well, that creates a problem. And who is it a problem for? Well, it's a problem for Northerners, because Northerners don't want to see the largest slave state in the Union join. And so this controversy over Texas arises. And this gives you a little bit of insight in terms of how things are changing in the country, because before, when we talked about American history, for the most part, there's never been a debate about annexing land. Americans north and south agree on this idea of manifest destiny, right? Which is, it's the destiny of the United States to expand westward. Even the Federalists couldn't disagree with Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase. It's like, just think of a time in the book or through the chapter quizzes or in the last review, has there ever been a time the U.S. has refused to add more territory? And the answer is no. Now, things are changing to where you're having this issue of slavery becoming maybe more important than territory. And so this controversy over Texas and wanting to join the U.S. is fundamentally rejected by Northerners. And this, of course, is only, as more and more people move out west, this problem about slavery in the Western territories is only becoming more and more intense. So this kind of changes a little bit when James K. Polk becomes president. I would say probably the most important one-term president the United States had ever had. And the important thing to know about Polk is that he's an expansionist. It's under his presidency that Texas is added to the U.S., despite what the North has to say. Oregon is added to the United States. And of course, ultimately, the Mexican cession is added. And because there was such an intense, I think I spelled session wrong, but that's okay. It's an O. There we go. Mexican cession. Because James K. Polk is committed to expansion, he has his eyes set on California. California, like Texas, though, had belonged to Mexico. And it's this dispute over land, not necessarily between California, but essentially what you have is, so here's Texas, here's the U.S., here's Mexico. And Texas joins the U.S., right? The United States says the border is right here. Mexico says the border is right here. You have this territory in the middle that, the U.S. says belongs to them. Mexico says that it belongs to them. Ultimately leads to a war with Mexico, right? The Mexican-American War. Now, the war itself is not necessarily all that significant. What is significant, though, is that at the end of the war, the United States gets a huge chunk of Mexican territory, right? So the United States wins the war with Mexico, which includes California. Now, as you might imagine, once the Mexican cession comes, once California becomes part of the United States, what's the debate going to be about? And of course, if you've been paying attention, the debate is going to be, is California a slave state or a free state? And that's the big question about California. Is California going to be free or slave? And you see this sectional, right? So sectional means the debate between, sectional means the different sections of the country, right? So here we're talking about North and South. And most of this is about what's going to happen to slavery in the land obtained from Mexico. All right, what's going to happen there? You have the Wilmot Proviso, again, a key term you're going to want to know. This is potentially one solution for it. Popular sovereignty, another good key term to know. Again, both of these will be on the test for sure. Where do the Democrats and Whigs stand on this issue? This new party called the Free Soil Party is founded specifically and only to ensure that slavery is prevented. But, for a while, it seems like whether California will be free or slave, it seems like there's enough time. Statehood is, when a territory becomes a state, it's based off of population, right? So there has to be enough people living in California in order for California to become a state. And really, Congress and the country, they can kind of wait. They don't have to decide it right now. They can wait till California becomes a state. Now, when most thought that there was time, right, you can kind of procrastinate on this. Gold is discovered in California in 1848, gold. And the gold rush is on. And people the very next year, called 49ers, moved to California, including many people from Asia, Chinese migrants. It has a dramatically negative impact on the Native American population there. But tons of people moved to California. And this ultimately leads to, because now, here's the problem. The population of California in 10 years went from something like 60,000 to 300,000 or something like that, right? Or even more significant. The problem is that California is ready for statehood, right? California has more than enough people to be a state. And they're going to become a state whether or not Congress can decide the question of slavery. So the fact that the gold rush occurred, people moved to California en masse, California is ready to become a state, and the country doesn't know what the status of slavery is going to be because Congress is arguing over this, right? Northerners are demanding a free state. Southerners are demanding a slave state, and they're not willing to compromise. They're not willing to compromise like they could over Missouri, like they did in the past. So this creates the crisis over California. Right? Crisis over California. So things are really beginning to heat up, right, between the North and the South when it comes to this particular issue. Now, here's where we get into the nitty-gritty of the details, right? And especially, I would say, this right here. Again, you can see it's the most detailed of all the outlines for the chapters that we've covered so far. So here's how things unfold, right? California. It's ready to become a state. Congress can't decide, right? California says, the people in California say, we are submitting and creating a constitution that makes us a free state. We're coming in as a free state. And the difference between California and Missouri and Texas is that for all practical purposes, there are no slaves in California. People moved to Missouri to grow, well, at that time, you probably grew cotton at that time. People moved to Missouri with their slaves to grow cotton. People moved to Texas with their slaves to grow cotton. People went to California not to grow cotton. They went to California to seek gold. And so for that reason, there aren't slaves in California, which makes this question a little bit easier. And so the people of California say, look, you and Congress can't decide what we're going to be. We are coming in as a free state, ready or not, right? Ready or not. Really, the leader on the pro-slavery position, John C. Calhoun, admits that California is likely to become a free state, that the South cannot hope for a slave state of California, but they will not let California come in as a free state, essentially for free, right? The South has to get something in return. This time, rather than Henry Clay, who attempts to solve this problem. Again, remember, Henry Clay was the great compromiser. He ends up passing away during this, this process. A new leader emerges, and that is Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas becomes the new compromise candidate, senator from Illinois. Stephen Douglas will find a way to get Northern and Southerners to agree on the free state of California. And that compromise is the compromise, and I just noticed, do I have that listed here? Maybe the book doesn't actually call it in its name, but that compromise, of course, is the Compromise of 1850, right? And let's go ahead and let's put this in yellow to say that it's important, right? The Compromise of 1850. So this is the compromise to allow, let's see, the compromise to allow California to enter in as a free state. There's also some other parts to it. There's 5 parts in total to the Compromise of 1850. The 2 most important ones are, number 1, California becomes a free state. That's good for Northerners. Okay, what does the South get? The South gets in return this right here, a new runaway or a new fugitive slave law. And it's this Fugitive Slave Act that is part of the Compromise of 1850 that will stir so much controversy and violence and hatred between the North and the South. It's this Fugitive Slave Act or runaway slave law in the 1850s and onwards that is so, either poorly written or nefariously written to where you have free blacks in the North who are being essentially apprehended and arrested by what they called slave catchers. and being forced into slavery. These were people who were accused of being runaways, who had not even run away themselves. They had never been slaves. They're getting caught by this law, which is much stricter and much harsher in terms of capturing runaway slaves in northern states, by the way, and ends up stirring a lot of hatred and violence and problems. The Fugitive Slave Act was really one of the first times that slavery was brought to northern cities and northern audiences. Slavery was always seen as a problem that was kind of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of northerners. But once you have these fugitives that are more or less roaming cities in the north looking for runaway slaves, it really causes a lot of problems, including violent confrontations and violent clashes. So when the Compromise of 1850 is signed, and again, this is the work of Stephen Douglas, there's a lot of celebration, in fact. Of course, the harsh effect of the Fugitive Slave Act wasn't known until the years after it actually went into effect and you actually had conflicts break out. But, Stephen Douglas was celebrated as the hero of the nation because at that point, manifest destiny was achieved, right? The United States stretched from Atlantic to Pacific. The Transcontinental Railroad, eventually, not yet, but the desire to build a transcontinental railroad was kind of the next big deal. And there would be no more question over free enslaved territory because after California was settled, after it was determined that California would be a free state, there was no other land in the U.S. that was up for debate, right? The problem was settled. So it had really looked in 1850 like the biggest problem in the country, that is the debate over Western territory, it had looked like that had been solved. However, here comes Kansas, Nebraska, which is the most important law ever passed in American history. The Kansas-Nebraska Act essentially sets to create two new states, Kansas and Nebraska. Now, Kansas and Nebraska had previously been free soil, right? The Missouri Compromise stated Kansas and Nebraska would be free. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was passed by Stephen Douglas, said, actually, we're going to change that, right? We're going to cancel out the Missouri Compromise, and instead, Kansas and Nebraska will not be free soil, but rather be open to slavery via popular sovereignty. Again, this is one of the key terms that I said that you should likely know. Popular sovereignty means that the citizens will vote. Oops. That's not what I wanted. Citizens will vote whether it'll be slave or free, right? So the reason why this one is egregious, why is the Kansas-Nebraska Act so much worse by comparison compared to other things like the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the controversy over adding Texas? The reason why Kansas-Nebraska is so much worse is because you're taking soil that was free, right? Slavery had been prohibited. The Missouri Compromise said this is free soil, and now you are opening it up to the possibility of slavery. And that for many was completely unacceptable. You can't change the rules, right? You want to argue about Missouri, argue about Texas, argue about California, that's fine, because we haven't said what those territories are. We haven't said whether they're free or slave. We can decide that, but we've already decided here, and now you're changing it. So a lot of Northerners said, look, if you can change this, if you can change Kansas and Nebraska from free to potentially being open up to slavery, then essentially nowhere is safe. That potentially anywhere could be opened up to the possibility of slavery given these rules. A new political party was created, the Republican Party, which was the anti-Kansas-Nebraska Party. All right, this was strictly the party of the North. And the second party system, the Democrats, versus Whigs, right? These two political parties that had been so dominant in the country ever since Andrew Jackson, they broke apart, right? The Kansas-Nebraska Act killed the second party system because rather than Democrats and Whigs siding with each other, it strictly became a matter of Northerner and Southerner, right? All Northerners were against Kansas-Nebraska. All Southerners were in favor of it. And it passed, right? Stephen Douglas was such a good politician, he got the Kansas-Nebraska Act to pass. And so they would vote in Kansas. And what happened in Kansas when they were going to vote for slavery? People killed each other in Bleeding, Kansas. Illegal voting took place. Cities like Loris, Kansas were sieged up as if it were a battleground. You had radical abolitionists like John Brown massacring people. You had senators like Charles Sumner, a senator from the North, and Preston Brooks, who was a congressman from the South, fighting in Congress, right? Preston Brooks beat Charles Sumner into a coma on the Senate floor, right? Nothing good came from Kansas, Nebraska, right? Nothing good came from it. It led to an increase in violence. And the whole reason why Douglas wanted to do it was because in order to build a railroad, in order to build the transcontinental railroad across the country, you needed to have statehood, because statehood means that those states can pass laws, taxes, stuff like that. So the act was passed kind of with slavery not even being the first priority, just kind of being at the back of their minds. In fact, many assumed that Kansas would be a slave state, Nebraska would be a free state, and nobody would care, and everybody would go along, with their day. But that wasn't the case. Once you said, we will vote in Kansas on the status of slavery, that's where you had people moving there like John Brown willing to fight. And eventually it called for over 1,000 federal troops to come in and put an end to the violence. And at the end of the day, they didn't know whether or not Kansas was going to be a free or slave state, because both sides contended that the voting was not legal. The slave state of Kansas won, but Northerners said, no, we're not going to acknowledge the slave state of Kansas because that was illegal voting. And essentially what was illegal about it was that you had people from the state of Missouri coming over, voting in the elections and moving back. They weren't part of Kansas. A little bit more about the arguments for and against slavery that are talked about a little bit in your book. Of course, Southerners tried to continue to justify slavery. Politicians continued to argue about whether or not slavery should continue to spread, whether they support Kansas or not. You have rulings by the Supreme Court, a Supreme Court that is mostly pro-South, especially Roger Taney, right? He more or less agreed with the Southern position. Continued deadlock over Kansas. Here's where you get the rise of Lincoln. Lincoln never really had a strong political career prior to this, but he was from the North. He was a member of the Whig Party. And when the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, for Abraham Lincoln, this was completely unacceptable. He had actually had a brief, kind of a brief moment in politics with the Mexican War. This is sort of a side note, where he came out against the war with the Spot Resolution. But because he came out as anti-war, he was voted out of office. And so he just went back to being a lawyer. When he came back out of retirement, you might say, when he came back into politics, he ran for Senate in Illinois. And this gave rise to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And the two were running for the Senate seat of Illinois, and every single time they debated, it eventually got back to the topic of slavery. And really what this election meant, this was 1858. Lincoln loses the election, actually, but it really leads to the rise of Lincoln. He became a national figure because he got on the stage with Stephen Douglas, who was this giant, right? Stephen Douglas had been the hero of 1850, the zero of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But he had gotten on this stage with Stephen Douglas, who was called the Little Giant. He was, a huge political contender, and Lincoln went toe-to-toe with him. And Lincoln took the position of being against the expansion of slavery. And Douglas took the position of compromise. Douglas took the position of he's willing to extend slavery if it makes the country happy. A couple of other key events: John Brown's failed slave rebellion, 1859, leads to more violence. And then finally, in 1860, Lincoln is elected as the Republican candidate for president, and 1860 becomes a crucial year. So, that's chapter 13. So I'd say, especially in relation to the way that these events unfold, right? How you go from controversy in, Texas, right? Texas annexation and everything that, happened with slavery regarding that, to California, to the Compromise of 1850, to Kansas, Nebraska, right? All of these things are important. Dred Scott, something I didn't mention here, John Brown's raid. What I would suggest is, you already have this kind of in, in an outline format as it is, but it might be helpful just to have a piece of paper while you're taking this test and just write down kind of the order of those events, how they unfolded and how they caused, each other, et cetera, et cetera. All right, chapter 14, the chapter on the actual Civil War itself, right? The chapter on the Civil War itself. So, secession. Secession means to leave the Union. And you had already had people like John C. Calhoun, who are at this point dead, but you had already had people in the South threatening secession over this question of slavery in the Western territories. The moment where it becomes a reality is 1860. Oops. Actually, I can just do this. The moment that Lincoln is elected president, right, and he wins an election in 1860, which he was only voted for by the free states. He didn't receive a single vote from a slave state. Winning only the free states, Lincoln wins the election. It's at that moment that South Carolina becomes the first state to secede or break away from the Union, followed by 6 other states, which makes 7 total. They meet in Montgomery, Alabama, and create their own confederation called the Confederate States of America, or CSA. And this is, of course, a crisis for Lincoln, right? What is Lincoln to do? First day on the job, 7 states have left the Union. Lincoln doesn't want to use violence. He's reluctant to use violence. He wants to bring those states back into the Union. Of course, you read or can read Lincoln's, or at this point you may not have read the sources relating to the Civil War, but Lincoln gives his first inaugural address, saying to those 7 states, don't break away, come on back. And of course, tensions are very high. However, it doesn't turn violent until Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a federal fort located in South Carolina, and they refused to, the people who were in the fort, refused to surrender to the state of South Carolina. And as a result, South Carolina fired upon Fort Sumter. And this is the first shots fired in the Civil War. So just like Lexington and Concord was the shot heard around the world for the American Revolution, Fort Sumter was the first shots fired in the Civil War. One last compromise, the Crittenden Compromise, fails. North and South are too far apart at this point. When Fort Sumter surrenders to forces in South Carolina, you have more states secede, including Virginia. And at that point, the battle lines of the Civil War are drawn up. There's a little bit of talk about the differences between North and South. Here's kind of a good thing. There will be some questions about advantages and disadvantages. All right, so the Civil War is North versus South. Right. So which side had advantages and disadvantages when the Civil War broke out? The next 2 sections talk about the North and the South in this war. Again, there's going to be a lot of laws, terms, events that you want to know, people especially. The generals and the individuals who are associated in the Civil War, that they're great for matching sections, especially the generals, so know that. So you got some laws here in terms of financing the war. The problems with raising armies, and this is kind of an important point to note, is that when it came to the draft riots, and drafting, of course, is conscripting soldiers for the military, when it came to those riots, most of them happened in the North, not the South, right? The North had a much bigger problem with mobilizing people's minds and mobilizing people's attitudes. Again, just general key terms that you should know. Know what a border state is. Know what the border states are. There are 4 of them. Know who George McClellan is. Radical Republicans, Confiscation Act. Of course, the big change in the Civil War is the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So you have start of the Civil War. You have the end of the Civil War. When does Lincoln free the slaves? It's kind of a trick question. It's during the war. It's a very important point to note, especially if you're going to write about the second essay topic. 1862. So the war starts 1861, ends 1865. Very important point if you're going to talk about that question. So when we get to the conclusion of the Civil War does 2 things. It keeps the country together, right? So the war began when South Carolina broke away and a bunch of other states followed. When the war ended, and of course many of the reasons why they broke away were related to slavery, but when the war ended, it kept the country together. So there's only one United States, and slavery was abolished throughout the whole country, not just the North, but slavery was done for throughout the whole country. And what made that possible was the Emancipation Proclamation given by Lincoln. More or less gave Southern states an ultimatum, said, look, you can either free your slaves or we're going to do it for you. And when Lincoln put that proclamation down, it wasn't, the fighting had already started, but it had more or less made sure that if the North won, that abolishing slavery would become a reality. And so the question for you on your essay is, okay, it does these 2 things, but what's the best way to understand the Civil War? So there's no right or wrong answer in that. Is when we think about the Civil War, if we can only say that it's understood as doing one thing, or it's best understood as one thing, is this war best understood as the war that kept the country together? Or was this the war that's best understood as the war to abolish slavery? And those are the 2 positions that you can take. And of course, the fact that this came during the war is an important distinction to make, right? It's kind of like the point that I made about the American Revolution earlier, was that, independence was declared after the fighting had started. Same thing here. Emancipation was declared after the fighting had started. In terms of the South, for the South, it's really a problem about money and manpower. The North has, know these people, Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens. The North has enough money, they have enough people, they have enough guns, they have enough ammo. The big question for the North during the war is, do they have the will to fight? And do they have the strategy? Do they have the generals? For the South, it's do they have the money? Do they have the troops? Do they have the food? It's more of a material war for the South. There's a section here about strategy and diplomacy. Again, all these people you're going to want to know. Ulysses Grant, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. These are significant individuals. There's going to be a question that will give you a list of generals. I'm going to ask you whether or not they fought for the North or the South. So maybe go back and check, okay, who's fighting on what side, right? That'll be significant. And then lastly, the chapter on the specific battles of the war. And I want to bring your attention to the kind of important turning points to take note of. Pay attention to the technology in the war, right? Rifles, railroad, telegraphs. A lot of these were new technologies playing out on the battlefield for the very first time. There wasn't a lot of experience with this. The battle, even though the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the first major battle was the Battle of Bull Run between Union and Confederate forces. The Civil War was fought in two what we call theaters, the West and Virginia. Virginia was the main theater. This was where the war would be won or lost. The Western theater was more about transportation lines and whatnot. Again, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, Antietam. Antietam was important because it was Union victory at this battle. It was, you could say, Union victory. This led Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. If you only remember one battle from the Civil War, Gettysburg. Gettysburg might be the most important battle in all of American history. 1863. Union or North victory. This was the turning point. Even though the Union had all the advantages, even though the North had, the advantages, as the war was unfolding, the North wasn't doing well. There were serious doubts as to whether or not the North could win. But after the Union defeated the Confederacy at Gettysburg, at that point, it was, that was the turning point. That's when the North really started to win. No generals like Sherman and what his march to the sea entailed. And of course, the last battle when General Lee of the Confederacy surrendered to General Grant, formally ending the Civil War, right? So you get through sort of a rundown of all the battles that took place here. Okay, let's get the last chapter, chapter 15. So the war has concluded. The Union is saved, right? So the country is sticking together. Slavery is abolished, right? No more slavery. Chapter 15 is the now what section, right? Now what, right? The Union stuck together. 600,000 people are dead, by the way, the deadliest war in American history. Slavery is done for, right? It's done. It's not just about West or North. It's everywhere. It's gone. Now what, right? Now what? And so you get a little bit about some of the laws and policies that started to kick in afterwards. Organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau were established to assist former slaves with their newfound freedom. But when we look at Reconstruction, which is the time period after the Civil War, right? So we get Civil War. After the Civil War is over, we call this Reconstruction. To reconstruct, literally rebuild from when the war is over, but also to rebuild the relationship. There are more or less three plans for Reconstruction, right? Three plans in terms of like, what's the now what part? And three amendments. And absolutely know your three plans. And absolutely know your three amendments, right? Okay, first plan for Reconstruction. Lincoln's plan, right? Abraham Lincoln, before the war was over, had a plan of what to do afterwards, called it the 10% plan. However, members of his own party, the Radical Republicans, didn't 100% agree with it. The Wade Davis bill was an effort to try and essentially change Lincoln's plan, right? So Lincoln is getting flack from his own side. Now, does Lincoln's plan ever go into effect? The answer is no. And that is because just 5 days after the war was over, Lincoln was assassinated, right? He was killed. And so Lincoln's plan in terms of what to do next never fully went into effect. However, he did make sure to ratify the first of the 3 amendments, and that was the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. You might be asking yourself, well, wait a minute. Didn't you just say that the Emancipation Proclamation abolished slavery? Yes, it did in 1862. However, the Emancipation Proclamation only abolished slavery in the states that were part of the Confederacy, right? So the states that had seceded and had fought against the Union, right? The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in those states. Okay, well, aren't all the slave states in the Confederacy? The answer is no, right? And this is one of the terms that I wanted you to take note of earlier. Remember, border states. A border state is a state in which slavery is legal, but fought for the North during the Civil War. Right? A border state is a state in which slavery is legal, but fought for the northern side during the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery in every U.S. state, including the border states. Right? Including the border states. One plan down, one amendment down. Good. So after Lincoln, right, is killed by John Wilkes Booth, the second and third plans are as follows. Plan number 2, presidential reconstruction. That, of course, is led by the vice president, now president, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is from the South. And his plan for Reconstruction is very much what we might call pro-South. The third and last plan is Radical Reconstruction. This is Congress. These are members of the North. These are very much pro-South. Oops, that's wrong. These are pro-North, not pro-South. Let me get my drawback. There we go. Uh-oh, what did I do? Pro-North. And so when we look at the battle for Reconstruction, because Lincoln dies so early in this, right? Again, he died 5 days after the war is over. The real battle for Reconstruction is between the president, Andrew Johnson, and Congress and the Northerners, right? You see laws like the Black Codes being enacted during President Johnson's time in office. You see Congress move to pass a law on civil rights only to be met by a veto. You see Congress adopt the 14th Amendment, again, which is Amendment number 2, you should know, 1314. What does the 14th Amendment do? Well, it grants equal protection under the law, right? That's an important one. Eventually, though, Andrew Johnson gets impeached by Congress. Impeachment is the process to remove the president. That this clash over Reconstruction, Congress, Johnson, pro-North, pro-South, this clash over Reconstruction leads Congress to impeach Johnson. They more or less come this close to kicking him out. But after Johnson is nearly impeached, Congress gets their way. And so it's this third plan, Congressional Reconstruction, which divides the South into military districts, which puts forward the 15th Amendment, which is universal male suffrage, which includes Black Americans, Black men, the right to vote. It is by denying former Confederates the right to vote, right? Congressional plan is way strict, right? Really wants to take revenge on the South for what they did. After Andrew Johnson is impeached, that's when Congress gets their way. And so for the most part, the way that Reconstruction is sort of carried out under Congress is by the use of more or less brute force, right? Brute force. So Reconstruction becomes, really a battle between these two plans, Johnson versus Congress. Even though Johnson, got in the way a lot, ultimately, Johnson is almost kicked out of office, and Congress kind of reigns supreme there. And so the question is, well, how is, Congress was successful in getting it passed? Well, what did it actually look like on the ground? Well, Reconstruction becomes a long drawn-out process. Right? You have 13, 14, and 15. These are all amendments, and they're going to be enforced by the military. Right? How does Congress know that Black Americans in Georgia are being granted equal protection under the law? How do they know that they're going to have the right to vote? Well, the U.S. military is there to make sure of it. Right? It was called Bayonet Rule. But it dragged on for a long time. And in order to ensure that those amendments were being abided by, being followed, the military presence there had to continue. And as more and more time went on, increasingly, Southern governments protested this, right? They protested it using the 3 myths of Reconstruction. That was to convince Northerners to bring an end to this military rule. You can look at what a scalawag is. You can look at what a carpetbagger is. But of course, one of the myths was this myth of, what we call black rule. Your book calls it Negro rule, but black rule. And this was the idea that because blacks now had the right to vote, that blacks were ruling over whites in the South, and that Northerners need to do something about that. Of course, that wasn't the case. In terms of how slaves adjusted to this new way of life, was that most of them entered into sharecropping, right? So in terms of, and I think I may have a question about this in your exam, but what did most former slaves do in terms of their job? Most of them became sharecroppers, and these are more or less farming on other people's lands, and they come with their own problems. So your book kind of discusses the economic kind of pitfalls of Reconstruction, where Reconstruction really failed former slaves economically. Not too much to talk about Grant. Grant was a Union general during the Civil War after Johnson's time in office. Grant becomes president. Grant is a defender of Reconstruction. He really wants to see 13, 14, and 15 be carried out. However, though, he was also not a good president, and he was also very corrupt. And so as Reconstruction goes on, more and more people become what you might say frustrated with Grant. And because they don't like Grant, they then, Reconstruction kind of, it suffers from that. Your book then talks about the abandonment of Reconstruction. That really is kind of what the story is. At first, the radical Republicans and even President Grant were pretty, they were very committed to upholding the promise of Reconstruction. You saw organizations like the KKK or Ku Klux Klan use violence to prevent a lot of these new changes that were taking place, and the federal government responded with the Enforcement Acts, which more or less sent the military after groups like the Klan. And there was a willingness to commit federal troops and sort of keep the promise of what Reconstruction meant. But as time went on, not only Southerners who always wanted to end the military rule in the South, and Southerners who wanted to end Reconstruction, but even Northerners became kind of sick and tired of Reconstruction, and the commitment just kind of dissipated over time. You had a bad economic panic that occurred that again made more people kind of skeptical of Grant. And, this culminated in 1876 with the presidential election, where you had Hayes, the Northerner, Tilden, the Southerner, and it was a tie. Disputed returns. There was accusations of illegal voting, and they came to a compromise in 1877 because they didn't want another civil war to happen. I mean, this presidential election was so close and so disputed with illegal voting and everything else like that, that in order to settle it and avoid some sort of conflict, they would come to a compromise. And the compromise was that Hayes would become the next president of the United States. So Northerners won the presidency. What did the South get? What did Tilden supporters get? Well, they got an end to Reconstruction. So why is the Compromise of 1877 important? It is important because it ended Reconstruction. And what do we mean by end Reconstruction? We mean Union troops leave, right? The troops are gone, right? So the soldiers that were there to enforce 13, 14, and 15 are no longer there, right? No longer there. Last section here, you can cover the New South. The New South was the idea that the Old South, which was secession, I don't know if that's spelled right. So proponents said that the Old South, secession and slavery, that is dead. Instead, there needs to be an industrialized South. The South should copy the North. Is that right? Industry. It's so hard to see. Everything looks so weird writing on this. I can't tell if anything is ever spelled correctly. Anyways, the New South was industry. All right, that's right, industry. And then, of course, some individuals who were important in promoting that idea. But I want to focus here for a second. And we don't really get to talk about this that much in this class because we only go up to the Civil War. But, you know, this looks at the legacy of Reconstruction, right? What happened in the aftermath? And even though the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were on the book, right? The right to vote, equal protection under the law, and the abolition of slavery, these things were replaced by what we call the Jim Crow South. This is the idea of separate but equal. Right, separate but equal. So even though all these things were on the books, state governments were more or less able to find ways around it. So even though the 14th Amendment said equal protection under the law, the ruling of separate but equal, which was made by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, said, well, okay, you could have equal institutions, right? So you could have two schools, but still have them be separate. And so this Jim Crow South is the rise of this segregated society where you have not just a school, but you have white schools and black schools. You have white restaurants and black restaurants, which is enforced by law. And as long as those two institutions were quote unquote equal, it didn't break the 14th Amendment. Now, of course, the reality was that in fact they weren't equal, right? And so this is then the legacy of Jim Crow, which more or less lasts all the way up until 1965 with Martin Luther King Jr., et cetera, et cetera. Same thing with the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment strictly states you can't deny someone the right to vote based off of race. However, state governments could create different laws. Okay, it's not going to be based on race, but we'll make everybody who wants to vote take a test, or we'll make everybody who wants to vote, pay money. And so you see, the voting rate go from something like 80% of blacks voting down to about 5%, even though technically it wasn't a violation of the 15th Amendment. It was just more kind of creative ways of getting around it. And so most people would state, and with the 13th Amendment, people have people have brought attention to things like the prison system, sharecropping, which again is not the exact same thing as slavery, but there are some parallels that you might be able to draw here. And so there's a question as to and historians, it's a good topic to argue about. How much really did change with 13, 14, and 15, and what is the legacy of those amendments? And for that reason, most historians would agree that Reconstruction was a failure. Right, for that reason. Again, you get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty with the next part of U.S. history. You get to talk more about this here, but we end with Reconstruction. Again, 3 plans: Lincoln, Johnson, Congress. 3 amendments, 13, 14, 15. You'll be in good shape. Okay, so I'll go ahead and call it and wrap it up right there. That puts me at, how much time is that? A little bit under 2 hours again. So I really, really hope that this has been helpful. Again, I will just stress that in terms of the workload, this week more so than any other week that we've had so far, you have probably more assignments and more to do this week. So finish up those chapter quizzes, do that primary source discussion, and then figure out kind of how you want to prioritize your exam and or your essay. So this will probably be the last time that I talk to all of you. So I just want to say I really appreciate all the hard work that many of you have put into the class. I know that for some of us, this is the first time doing an online course. And of course, for myself, it's not the first class that I've taught online, but it's something that I continue to try and get good at. And I hope that you were able to take something of value away from this course besides simply just the GE requirement that most of you are enrolled in this course to do. So best of luck on the exam. Best of luck on whatever future educational sort of trajectories that all of you go. And that'll be it.